In this talk, I would like to introduce the topic application programming interfaces for language technologies. This is part one of this series of talks, and it covers a basic introduction to application programming interfaces and their importance to the language technology unit within the National Language Institute. My name is Kudakwashi Dube. Of course, my family is well known to with the surname Rukanda. I'm currently a senior research fellow at King's College London in the United Kingdom. My interests are in using computing technologies. My core research focus is basically on computable knowledge modeling, and with special focus. Most of my projects has been mainly applying modeling knowledge and how we can create technologies that can reason using knowledge. In other words, we take knowledge and try to make it computable, make it understandable by a computer, and then such that computers can start using them. We can create technologies that can reason. And of course, language plays an important role in that work. An example of a project I'm currently working on is where we have we are focusing on how to manage complications in pregnancies. We have talked to clinicians, to various clinicians from various departments, and we have extracted knowledge from literature from these experts, and we have modeled the knowledge using some computational formalisms. In our case, at the moment, I'm using what are called causal Bayesian networks. In other words, we are modeling this knowledge such that they become computable and they can become usable. After that, we have actually completed that, and I'm now building an app, possibly a web and a mobile app, that would allow clinicians to get advice on how to manage and even predict pregnancies, pregnancy complications. So that's an area that I am working on. And language plays a very important role in that case. So today I would be talking about application programming interfaces, what they are and how they work. We also will be talking about why application programming interfaces are important to the language unit of the National Language Institute, and also how we can commercialize our works, all the works of the various departments of the National Language Institute, by using API, these application programming interfaces. In other words, I'm proposing that the National Language Institute seriously considers an API business, like a lot of other companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and all these other companies. Usually they develop their own apps, but they take an API approach. Their apps talks to the API, and they then sell the API. Even though they have their own apps, they can they can have an API business. Right, let's start by looking at what is an API. An application programming interface is basically an interface between multiple applications, and it allows two applications to communicate by following a question-answer paradigm, which is similar to the way we do. We talk to each other. We make a statement, another one responds, question answer, sort of. If it doesn't even have to be a question, it could be a request and a response. Normally, some of our statements, of course, look at response, but applications do not speak human language, so there is need for data formats. This is an area that's very important. Sometimes we do find standard data formats already defined by standard bodies internationally. We always prefer to use those. Where there is nothing suitable for us, we can create our own data formats. It is important here, before I proceed, to note that you are all using APIs, even your mobile apps. As long as you have YouTube, you have Twitter, you have Flickr, and Google Maps, they publish an API, which is represented in this diagram with these dot points. Each API has got a specific purpose. So questions are directed to specific parts of the API in order to provide information that has been requested by apps. So we all use apps on a daily basis. Right. Here's an example. We have Duramanzi, Guru Rechishona, of course. Apologies for the spelling for Duramanzi. We can ask a question, Shoko irinore a. Right. And you can get the answer that says kuti a kuratidza kushamiswa zvose nokushora. Right. So an API can be built for the Shona dictionary because in general the dictionary operates through a question answer paradigm. Right. Normally an API accepts a request. In this diagram here, you will see that normally a user, maybe your mobile phone, can make a request, in this case to Instagram, which is they have an API for all the pictures and photos that are saved by people on Instagram. People put pictures. I'm not sure whether they now put videos, but Instagram used to be just a photo. So you can make a request like, "Hey, Instagram, can you like this publication?" Right? And usually, when you like, you click something which is equivalent to the request to the API, the like API, and then of course Instagram will respond. The API will respond by saying, "Okay, I have saved it as your favorite or your like," and then it displays the response by maybe changing a certain icon that shows that you have liked this photo, right? So all that interaction, it might be a simple click on your part, and once you click it, the color may change, but that has been an API. Your app has been talking to Instagram via an API, Instagram API. Of course, as I have said, we don't use the language like the way humans do. So normally the interaction is done in a technical way. And the technical way usually is based on the internet technology. So we present it more or less like a URL where one of the commands or the get command is specified, and then you provide more specific parameters. For instance, like username. In this case, you want to get pictures for a particular username, and then that you present a request that way. The receiver gets this and gets, of course, what exactly you are requesting with specific information, and then it responds again in a technical way. This is responding in JSON, in a format called JSON. It's a data format, and once your app receives it, it reformats it properly so that you can now watch it. So it is important to realize that when we make requests, we don't use language. On this slide, I am just demonstrating how my basic Shona API for the Duramanzi Guru Shona. I wrote some code that allow you to submit a word, and then it would respond with the meaning of that word in Shona. Right. Of course, it's still basic at the moment. I have not fully developed the API, and also I haven't tagged the entire dictionary. I only looked at page 1 with the words that start with an A. And so in this case is the word address. So this is a query that goes into the dictionary and then extract the meaning of a word, and then provide a snippet of a HTML code, which is then displayed like the ones you see in the response with the word, with the response to the word. Right. We build APIs on the basis of internet technology, and we use the protocol called HTTP, which is something that is common. You see this always in your browsers when you go from website and so on. You see HTTP, then followed by www and all that stuff. So there are only basic commands that you can use for the internet, and this is where we build our API. The 4 basic commands are get for getting data, put, we use it to update a piece of data, post is to create a new piece of data, and delete is basically to delete a word. A typical example is when you use get, you can say, like, if I want a meaning of the word address, I could simply say get meaning of address. Or if I want to update a particular meaning in the dictionary, I could say update the meaning of this by using put. And post, of course, I could also just add a new word which didn't exist in the dictionary. And of course, you can delete a dictionary, a word from a dictionary. Of course, you normally don't do that. Actually, some of these commands you can block them in your API, but API is built simply on these internet commands. Your browsers use them. Your browsers are every day when you browse the internet, you use get, and sometimes when you are filling in a form, you use put or post as well. Right. Why is it important for the language technology unit to develop API? First, the most important thing to note is that the API approach allows us to separate concerns, to follow the principle of separation of concerns. This is a principle that is very important in engineering, especially in software engineering, where you separate the visible part, which is the front end. The front end is what you usually call an app, like WhatsApp and so on. Then there is the invisible part, which is the back end. The back end will be the databases. A user normally don't see them, so they are invisible. So we call that the back end. Right. The front end technology, this design mechanism can allow you to change the front end technology without affecting the back end. In other words, because you just send the request, you can change the front end. The same with the back end technology. You can actually change it without, and also the technology you use, you are not tied to one form of technology, right? The other important aspect is that you can easily commercialize. Commercialization becomes easy. We'll discuss that later. And also dissemination of all the National Language Institute deliverables can be done easily via API, while also allowing others to develop. For instance, if you can change the API, it means you can even have many of them, which means you can allow many people to develop apps that can talk to the API. And that allows the entire population of our languages. We have all those official languages in Zimbabwe. We have people who can develop apps. We don't have to develop all the apps for them. All we need to develop is the API. They can use whatever technology they want, which can talk to our API. And it's guaranteed that it can talk to them because it uses internet technology, internet infrastructure to define the API. So, for instance, in this diagram, you can see the various technology on the back end, which is the right hand. You can have various technologies. Of course, I don't have to specify them here because they may not be familiar to you guys. But for those who are in IT, you understand that the back end can basically use different technologies, the front end different technologies, and also you can have many apps accessing the same API at the same time. So that unleashes a whole landscape, an entire platform that allow creativity to flourish with respect to our languages. Right, now let's look at commercialization of the API business. It is important to note that large companies like Google, Amazon, Oracle, and all these other companies, they develop APIs. They are in the API business. For instance, Google is big on APIs. They allow you to use the APIs like Google Maps, Google Docs, even Gmail. They also provide the API. Although they have their own apps, they also provide the API, which means developers can develop the API. The commercialization element comes because you can measure requests, aspects of a request. You can measure how many requests are done per minute, and you can charge based on certain metrics that you can apply to the request itself. For instance, you can measure, for instance, how much resources are required to answer a request, to respond to a request. And once you measure it, you can cost it, and therefore you can put a price to a request, which means you can come up with a big business there. It doesn't matter what app is being used and who developed it. As long as they can make a request, you can cost it and measure it. So an API business is, the API is a valuable part of a project or a series of projects, and it is important for the National Language Institute through the Language Technology Unit to develop these APIs as a basis of commercialization. The advantage, of course, is the fact that for each request, you can measure many things. You can measure the resources used, you can measure even the electricity that is being used to respond to that request, and then cost it. For example, a company that makes home deliveries will require a map because the drivers who are delivering need a map. So you can simply use Google Maps. But instead of using Google Maps apps, you can develop your own apps and access Google API. But Google charges you for accessing that API based on the request that you make on that API. So that is very important. Sometimes companies can simply develop an API and not develop an app, and let companies develop their own apps, which the National Language Institute can do without, if we don't have resources for developers, we just develop the API. Right. Now, some of the things that can be measured, especially for each request, is things like CPU time, memory usage, also requests per minute. You can measure them, average or maximum latency, errors per minute, things like usage growth. Some of the metrics can be used for maintenance stuff, but others can be used for costing a particular request. So the costing doesn't have to be put on the response, because the response is usually very minimal. You don't use much resources in the response, but it is the request that requires some computation. It may require calling a huge amount of resources, and as a result, it consumes resources like time, power, memory, storage, and so on. So especially intermediate storage in the computations. So you can actually cost that one. For each request, before even performing it, you can determine what resources are being used. So these metrics can then be used as a basis for the commercialization. Right. When setting up an API business for the purpose of commercializing APIs, it is important to consider these three pillars. Right. The three pillars are the service owners, the API core team, and the consumers. Right. The organization need to worry more about the three of them, but the ones that are resident within the institute, for instance, an organization, is the service owners and the API cores. But sometimes some of the service owners may need not necessarily belong to the organization. They could also be external, or it can be a collaborative effort between various players. Within the Language Institute, it's safe for now to say that the service owners are basically all the departments which produce something within the institute, and also the Language Technology Unit who develop the technology, which is the API. They develop it and maintain it as well. They also help with the digitization and the tagging of the various data sets and also various products, right? So it is important. I should also emphasize here is that the API should not be viewed only for data sets. It can also be for actual products like books, translations, translated versions of works, and so on and so on. So it is important to view every product as something that can have an API, so that at least you can have maximum dissemination. And also, it is always not necessary to develop an app. Each time you have an API, it's always not necessary to develop an app, but sometimes it is necessary so that you experience it, in order to give help or to document it so that others can also use it properly. If you use it while you develop it, you develop an app, but we don't have to develop apps for the community, for the community, because the community also have people who are creative enough to develop API. Commercialization can only be based on the API, right? So then the service owners are the producers. They own the backend services. They develop and maintain the backend APIs, and also they ensure compliance and performance, and also document. Whereas the API core team, in this case, I could consider service owners within the National Language Institute to be the language technology unit, and then the various departments, right? The source of the data, the people who create content within the National Language Institute. To disseminate that content, they need to have the language unit develop an API for that content, right? And of course, where necessary, they could then develop the app, an example app for that content. And sometimes you could do it. Whereas the API core team ensures success of API strategy. In other words, they formulate the strategy, and then they make sure that the strategy is implemented, and also they define the guiding principles, and also they manage the community, and also take care of the advertising. As developers, people in the IT, in the computer science aspect, or the engineers, may not be the ones who do the marketing. Maybe some other people can do the marketing. So the IP Echo team is ideally, when I think of the National Language Institute, you need a representative from each department to constitute the API core team. Because the API are a collaborative, multidisciplinary effort, projects especially. For instance, even if we talk of a dictionary, I can't just develop an API for dictionary. I need a language expert to guide some of the work, some of the aspects. Especially, for instance, when we tag, we need to tag data properly. Even when we talk of corpus, you need to work between linguists and computational linguists. Computational, computer science people need to also be involved. So it's a multidisciplinary effort. So the API core team is like a management board, which consists of representatives from all the units, including the language technology unit, right? The consumers, of course, are the people who use the API. These are the software developers for other apps. They are also ordinary people who might just want to, who use the apps. So in other words, you are using, you are looking at consumers who are developers, even companies that want to use the API for the languages, right? So you need a common vision, you need guiding principles, you need documentation, technology, data formats, and a strong development community, and some kind of a communication culture. So these things are very important for the API business. So you need to look closely at stakeholders and the roles that each of the stakeholders need to play. Now, the API core team connects service owners with which produces owners, and then the consumers who use the API, and also contribute bugs or issues, which leads to further development of the API. So these three are the core for the unit. So for most of the projects of the API, of the API of the Language Institute, it is important to develop these, to make sure we have at least a recognition, especially by setting up more or less like committees or teams that have to meet regularly and make sure, of course, this is what we do. Of course, most of the work starts with the API core team, who then, of course, define what, help to define the actual projects, which leads to the actual APIs. And then when these are developed, we then need, of course, the core team to then link with the consumers to promote it, developers and so on. Right. Proceeding in summary, I could say that I have talked about the application programming interface. I introduced it as an interface for applications to communicate among themselves and via the internet, especially via the internet. APIs use an answer or request response paradigm or question answer paradigm, and it uses the core technology of the internet, which means it uses four very simple commands that allow apps to communicate with each other. These commands are the same commands that your internet browser uses to access any website. The get, post, put, delete set of commands, there are four of them. So on top of that, that's where we build the API. Now, API is very important to the language technology unit. First of all, it's good engineering practice because it makes the technologies easy to manage by applying the principle of separation of concerns, where the back end is separated from the front end, which is the apps. So where technologies also can be changed. It's highly flexible and easy to maintain. You can scale as well, as you can replace the back end without affecting the front end. You can replace the front end without. So basically that. Commercialization is possible. Mainly, it's enabled by the API approach because you can cost requests more like water coming into your house can be metered. So it's possible to measure what's going on and also cost all those things. And in addition to that, it allows dissemination and share responsibility with the population, because the population will then be free to access the API at a cost, but also build their own apps which use the API, while also generating revenue for the institute. Now, there are a number of language API that can come to my mind at the moment. The dictionary API, the corpora API, translations API. In fact, all works that have been translated can be accessed via an API. In fact, basically every project you can think of, from video, audio, translations, even books, novels, everything can be provided to the community via APIs. And of course, we also have Tumo collection. You can also provide API for that. And there are many others which I cannot think about at the moment. But many of you already are producing, the various departments of the Language Institute are already producing products which can be presented via the API. So, in summary, that's my introduction to the API. I would welcome questions, discussions, especially or around these issues, especially brainstorming on possible APIs, especially brainstorming on the products that are being produced or will be produced by the National Language Institute, which requires dissemination, which requires digitization, which requires at least being incorporated into revenue programs by the institute itself. With that, I end this presentation.